There's one thing that I think quite a while ago people generally universally agreed on, and that was that Dan Slott's Spider-Man run was never the best or up to the standard that it needed to be. And while that may be true in some places, especially towards the end of the run, I do believe that he does get more stick than he deserves. The early Dan Slott comic run was actually really good when it came to Spider-Man. Personally, for what One More Day was, and you'll notice that when I make these videos this comes up a lot, Dan Slott's run really improved upon this and in my opinion was the best possible outcome from One More Day. But why was it really good? And how did it change Spider-Man forever? Let's find out. Dan Slott's Spider-Man has way more influence over modern versions of Spider-Man than you probably realize. Let's make one thing clear, One More Day really ruined Spider-Man, but if it wasn't for that event, the character probably would look totally different now, with Miles Morales being the main younger Spider-Man and Peter Parker would probably have MJ as his wife and would probably have kids in the mainline continuity if you really think about it. However, due to the retconning that happened, Dan Slott had to work with a very status quo like Spider-Man, meaning that everything was kind of set to how it was before MJ and Peter got married. And you'll notice that the status quo will be a massive theme throughout this video, and how Dan Slott questions, criticizes, and even sometimes changes the status quo when it comes to Peter Parker. Dan Slott managed to play around with the character that we had already seen before, which is a hard task when there is really only one direction for you to go in and set out by the previous comic books, or at least that's what it seemed like at the time. And that direction always ended up being with Peter getting back with Mary Jane, as he was so often with Mary Jane before One More Day. And even earlier in the Dan Slott comic run, where it wasn't really clear what their true intentions were, people generally thought that MJ and Peter were just gonna get back together because MJ and Peter are always together. That's just who they are. That is what makes the Spider-Man comics the Spider-Man comics. However, the Dan Slott comic books introduced an idea which still goes on to this day, which is the infamous back and forth between MJ and Peter. The good old will they won't they cycle started here, ladies and gentlemen, for good or for worse. And I know you guys are probably saying, oh, Dan Slott! Why'd you do this? This completely ruined comic books forever. Ah! And yes, you'd be right in saying that today, because in the Zeb Wells comic run, we know if you've seen my videos, it's not really that good. But at the time, this story actually really worked well and helped this new version of the character. People were still hanging over Peter and MJ, so this kept fans satisfied, whilst Dan Slott subtly took a very different approach with the character. And that's what makes this run so great, is that he managed to seemingly take a character whose destiny was basically already written and do something different. There was a sense of familiarity by still doing stuff with Mary Jane whilst also doing different stuff at the same time. It essentially had the core of the character still be about, whilst also doing very, very different stuff as well. During Dan Slott's first proper run on the character, which was the big time storyline, it saw Peter Parker become the man that he's always wanted to be. Well, not exactly, but Dan Slott takes him in a direction in which saw Peter Parker actually win for once. And this will loop back around when we talk about Superior Spider-Man, but we'll get there later on in the rest of the video. Now, I really like the big time storyline. If you're a fan of Spider-Man life story, or stories where Peter Parker is generally older and starting to figure stuff out, Spider-Man Big Time is the story for you. Basically, it takes the status quo established character that he was reset to during One More Day and then elaborates on him in a way which makes it feel like he's growing up, even though it is wildly known that Marvel editorials were trying their hardest to keep Peter Parker the same. Essentially, characters like Max Modell were introduced as a new mentor figure to Peter. Peter would eventually have a stable job at Horizon Labs, where he could be a scientist, which, given Peter's talent, makes total sense. He also got to design really cool suits and new tech. Now, this is a big staple of Spider-Man of the modern day. Tech-based Spider-Man was never really present until Dan Slott's run. Yes, he'd use little techie things here and there, and you know, Spider-Man's a clever guy, right? So he would use stuff now and again. However, until Dan Slott's run with the character, Spider-Man had never really been that big of a techie guy. That was left to the Iron Mans of the Marvel Universe, you know? Those type of characters were the guys with the big tech companies and the big tech suits and everything like that. But in the modern day, even if it's as far as the MCU goes with Spider-Man and tech, or whether it's just minor devices like the PS4 game uses, these versions of Spider-Man were inspired by the Dan Slott version, and this makes total sense. Remember, Slott was handed a version of the character that was basically the status quo, baseline Peter Parker that we'd already seen a million times, and the one in which many people grew up with before his marriage to Mary Jane. So Dan Slott had to do something different with the character, and I think adding tech and delving into a more science-based side of Spider-Man I think really helped spice up the character and the stories that Dan Slott was able to tell in his run. Now obviously tech and Spider-Man is a very controversial topic, and we could make a whole video on this topic alone, because there are two sides to the argument. Spider-Man has never been a tech-based character, however Spider-Man is smart enough to create tech, so there has to be a little grey area. Most people use the MCU as an example where tech doesn't really work that well, but people then use, for example, the PS4 game where they seemingly get it right with Spider-Man and tech. So yeah, it's like a little grey area in there, and whether you like tech with Spider-Man is a completely subjective thing, but I think it's clear that Dan Slott's intention here was to spice up the character, and it definitely worked, as a lot of modern adaptations of the Spider-Man character, whether it's movies, games, cartoons, are very, very tech-based nowadays. Another crucial character that was introduced in this story was Carly Cooper. Now, Carly Cooper was Peter's new girlfriend at the time, and yes, eventually they split up in favor of moving the character on and teasing the idea of him getting back with Mary Jane, as we mentioned earlier. But it was nice to see that Peter had new things going on in his life, and they weren't just going to take the same approach again that they did all those years ago. I think it's also important to note that the Ultimate Comics were at their peak at this time as well, which saw MJ and Gwen Stacy as the main love interests for that version of the character, so it was refreshing to see someone new. And as we know, Mary Jane and Gwen Stacy have always been the main two love interests when it comes to Spider-Man. I mean, just look at the movies, look at the cartoons, and even the early comics. MJ and Gwen are the two main love interests that are associated with Peter Parker. However, they decided to do something completely new, which I really, really like. However, moving on from big time later in the Dan Slott run, he gave us the Dying Wish storyline. Now, this story became ever so important, and if you know that it ties in directly to Superior Spider-Man. Now, you will have noticed that I mentioned a few times that Dan Slott wasn't afraid to tell different stories with Spider-Man, and almost modernize the character. Well, that's exactly what he did with Superior Spider-Man. This story blew everyone out of the water because it was something that we had never seen before. Even me, because this was before I stopped reading Spider-Man comics. Basically, I was a kid when this story came out. I think it was around 2011, so I would have been about 9-10 years old at the time. But I do remember it happening. I even have issue 700 of The Amazing Spider-Man, which saw the end of the Amazing Spider-Man comic run in favor to start Superior Spider-Man. I remember this happening, and I was too young to read big time in the stories that came before, but when this happened, I remember this was a big event. Dan Slott had the capacity to give us something new and refreshing, and personally, I believe that the Superior Spider-Man did something really clever with the character that had never been explored before, and that was improving Peter Parker's life to its absolute fullest. I mentioned that when Spider-Man Big Time came out, it was basically about Peter Parker's life actually going well for once and exploring those aspects of his life where, yeah, he is smart, he probably should be a scientist, he is going to be doing some more techie stuff. Well, Superior Spider-Man went the extra step and said, you know what, if Peter Parker's life was 100% perfection, this is exactly what it would be. Superior Spider-Man showed us exactly why all of this was the case, and after Doc Ock gained control over Spider-Man's body, the balance between Peter Parker's social life and the crime-fighting life of Spider-Man suddenly improved. One of the main criticisms of an older Peter Parker is the idea that he never moves away from the status quo, as we mentioned earlier in the video. Yeah, when he's a teenager, he has no money. He can't keep a stable relationship. He has to look out for Aunt May, and basically he can't get his work-life balance in order. These are main tropes of what make the character of Spider-Man, Spider-Man in the first place. And without them, he wouldn't even be Spider-Man. But as the comics have gone on and as the character has gotten older, these things have never ever subsided, which is where personally I have a problem with it. Now some might say that that's because these aspects of the character are too crucial to get rid of. And now I'm about to say something really controversial, so just brace yourself. I don't actually think that all of these issues are what makes Peter Parker Spider-Man at the core of the character. Now hear me out, okay? Just hear me out. I think there is one main theme that encapsulates all of these Parker issues, which people determine to make the character of Spider-Man Spider-Man in the first place. I believe at the core of all of these issues that Peter Parker has in his personal life is the hardship of being Peter Parker and Spider-Man at the same time. Now that seems fairly obvious, but when you really think about it in that aspect, that means that Peter doesn't really have to have a money problem. Peter doesn't have to have relationship issues. He just has to have a hardship between Peter Parker and Spider-Man. And having no money is just one way of doing the hardship. Having bad relationships is one way of representing the hardship between Peter Parker and Spider-Man. But when Peter gets older, you can move away from the money and the relationship issues and do something different. Like we mentioned earlier in the video, and I've made countless videos on this in the past, you can basically tell a story where Peter has to balance his family and being Spider-Man. That is a hardship of being Peter Parker and Spider-Man at the same time. But it doesn't necessarily include the Parker money problem. It doesn't necessarily include a bad relationship with Mary Jane. It's still a hardship, and hardship is what makes the character of Peter Parker in the first place. So do you see what I'm getting at here? But moving back on topic, the comics have never actually moved away from the classical representations of the hardship, which is how we've ended up with the Peter that we have in the comics nowadays, when we could instead have Peter dealing with the hardships of balancing a family life with Mary Jane, as we mentioned before. Either way, moving back onto Superior Spider-Man, this comic run was a criticism of the representations of the hardship which have existed for so many years. It showed that with the intelligence and determination of someone like Otto Octavius, that Peter could actually achieve a work-life balance. Instead of constantly being unavailable in his personal life because of crime around the city, Otto created Spider-Bots that would keep an eye on the city for him, which is something that Peter Parker, who is an intelligent person, should have thought about a long time ago. He'd create new suits for new situations and tech that would help in his crime fighting. And on top of all of that, he created Parker Industries, which showed the potential of Peter Parker's life and how great it could be. Now, I don't believe that we should ever go as far as Parker Industries when it comes to the Peter Parker character, because at that point, he's just Iron Man. We've got Tony Stark for that kind of lifestyle, right? But I do believe that it is totally realistic for Peter Parker to create his own company, or at least work as a high-functioning scientist while still keeping the hardships in other different aspects. And I think Dan Slott's run really took these criticisms and basically showed us that, yeah, Peter Parker's life could be perfect. It showed us the potential of Peter Parker's life and how great it could be. Either way, Doc Ock rectified these issues that the character of Peter Parker has suffered from, and I think it was really interesting that this storyline managed to tap into some of those aspects and questions that the fans may have had about a growing and maturing Peter Parker. Like, why couldn't Peter just ever sort his money out? Why can't Peter ever keep a relationship? Isn't Peter really smart? Can't he just become a scientist and create his own company? All of these questions. Superior Spider-Man answered all of them. But not only that, when Peter Parker returned, it actually wrapped up the story very nicely by showing us why Peter Parker could never uphold it in the same capacity that Doc Ock did as well. It's the moral and ethical sentiment of Peter Parker that actually holds him back, which is what keeps him in a position of the status quo. Although in modern comics they have gone way too far with the status quo like I mentioned before, I still think that they gave a valid reason to this issue. Overall, this aspect of Superior Spider-Man answered a lot of questions as to why Peter Parker had never ventured away from the status quo before, and they actually made it make sense. And not just that, as good as this was for the Spider-Man comics as a whole, Dan Slott also did something that I think not many comic writers seem to do. He developed and homed in on the villain of Doc Ock. It's no secret that comic books have forever had stagnant villains. Yeah, they may change, they may ebb and flow, get new costumes, develop new rivalries, but for the most part they are always villains and have never remotely changed in that aspect. That's why Otto Octavius is so special, because he managed to go from a monster of a man to a genius behind a mask. Superior Spider-Man developed Doc Ock into a wonderful character, and I'm gonna go even far and throw it out there and say that I don't think Doc Ock was even that good of a character in comparison to the likes of Venom and Green Goblin when it comes to Spider-Man villains before the Dan Slott era. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but Doc Ock in Superior Spider-Man remains a key aspect of what made the Slott run work so much in the first place. After the Superior Spider-Man is where the Slott run kind of fell apart, and it was really sad to see after so much success and praise that he had previously. We got cool stories like the return of Peter Parker and seeing how Superior Spider-Man affected his life, which led straight into Spider-Verse around 10 issues later. But apart from that, Slott's run dried up, and that's where I really stopped reading Spider-Man comics. It's not until recently, when I've heard how bad they've actually gotten, that I hopped back on the Spider-Man comic trend and started reading them again to make content for you guys. But either way, I think Slott gave us something really interesting and an interesting take on Peter Parker and Spider-Man as a whole. I think the main thing that we will take away from the Dan Slott run is that he mainly answered a lot of questions that the fans had about the status quo of Peter Parker, and I think it pulled up certain issues that the character may have faced and answered them brilliantly. I think he also introduced Spider-Man into the world of tech perfectly too, as we mentioned. He evolved the character in a perfect modern direction, and given the influence Spider-Man's character has on technology in the MCU, Slott's version of the character definitely came into play because of this. Slott's run is underappreciated for how much he did for the character and how much he changed them. I really like the Dan Slott run, and I recommend giving it a read if you haven't already. It's definitely worth it. Either way, thank you very much for watching this video. If you did enjoy, make sure to hit that like button, and also make sure to subscribe if you are new around the channel. Make sure to hit the bell so you do not miss another video as soon as it comes up on the channel as well. We post Spider-Man comic videos, we post videos about the movies, we post everything on the channel to do with Spider-Man. So like we said, make sure to join the members page as well. Just for as little as 99 pence a month, you can get every single video that I post early. And also, if you want to get the upper tier, which is £2.99 a month, you can get exclusive bonus content that is just for you, so only you can watch it. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next video. Take care, and peace.